Welcome to Living from the Soul. This is your host, Sam Terode, and today I'm honored to be speaking with Dr. Larry Dossey. One of my overriding interests, and a thread connecting most of my books, is the question, are we just physical beings, or is there a reality beyond what we can experience with our senses? Materialism, the dominant paradigm of modern science, says that the physical world is all that exists. Our minds are a product of the chemical reactions in our brains, and those brains evolved by a series of chance mutations in a random universe without purpose or meaning. To me, this view leads to despair, so I've always been interested in research about experiences and phenomena that can't be explained away by scientific materialism. That's what led me to Dr. Larry Dossey. Dr. Dossey is a leading voice bridging the worlds of science and spirituality. He was a practicing physician for many years and was chief of staff at Medical City Dallas Hospital. He also served as a battalion surgeon in the Vietnam War, earning the Medal of Valor and the Bronze Star. He's the author of 12 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Healing Words. I wanted to discuss his most recent book, One Mind: How Our Individual Mind is Part of a Greater Consciousness and Why It Matters. Dr. Dossey woke up with a hoarse voice on the day we spoke, but I don't think it detracted from the conversation. I hope you'll enjoy Dr. Larry Dossey. Hello, Dr. Dossey.
Sam, how are you?
Great. Well, your book, One Mind, is one of my all-time favorites. I'd say that and the book Science Set Free by Rupert Sheldrake. If I could get everyone in the world to read two books, I think those would be the two.
Well, I certainly admire your judgment. What can I say? I was reading through your bio, and I was struck by the fact that your writing about the soul parallels in many ways my writing about the one mind. I think we're talking about the same subject.
Yeah, I think we both had Emerson as a starting inspiration too.
That's right.
Well, I hear your Texas accent. I wondered if, looking at my books, if you saw my novel, The Dirty Parts of the Bible.
Yeah, I laughed out loud at that. I also saw where your mother grew up in Texas, I believe, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, she grew up near Fort Worth, and my grandparents were from Corsicana.
Oh, I know that well. That's 30 miles north of where I was born in a little town called Groesbeck, which was close to Waco.
Yeah, I think some of my relatives might have lived there at one point. Well, well, you've had quite a career. How did you get interested in medicine and be called to become a doctor?
Well, I'm not even sure I understand it. I started out in engineering at the electrical engineering at the University of Texas. And it didn't take me very long to realize that that wasn't what I wanted to do in life. I had an identical twin brother who was enrolled in the pharmacy school. So I just sort of followed him, and I got a degree in pharmacy from the University of Texas. But I discovered, that was a pretty horrible way to make a living. And so we both decided to go to medical school. We graduated with honors, so getting into medical school was no problem. And so I just sort of drifted into medicine after going through engineering and pharmacy. I was really adrift, to tell you the truth. But I hit my stride in medicine, and it was a genuine life calling. And so that's what happened.
And when did the Army get a hold of you?
The Army got a hold of me in 1968 after I had been practicing internal medicine for several years. In those days, you couldn't, if you were a doctor, you were just drafted. You had no choice. I spent a year in the boonies in Vietnam and came back and spent a year in an Army hospital. And so that took 2 years out of my life. I was lucky to get back unharmed. I was in the field with a combat unit and had a lot of close calls, as a matter of fact. So I'm lucky to be alive, to tell you the truth.
You could probably write a book about that.
Well, I wrote an essay once about my experiences in Vietnam, and it's the only thing I've ever written that won a national award. And
Hmm.
it was a lengthy editorial, which left little to the imagination.
Hmm.
So the answer to your question is yeah, it's in writing, and it was published in a journal called Alternative Therapies, which I served as executive director for many years.
Hmm. And then with internal medicine, what exactly does that involve? Were you doing surgeries or?
Well, it is sort of the thinking man's doctor. I guess you could call it a lot of diagnosis and planning therapy for patients, referring them to surgeons. We don't do any kind of surgery.
Hmm.
It's approaching a patient who has an unknown diagnosis, and you're supposed to be able to figure it out. It's sort of an intellectual approach, which I really adored and I was frankly pretty good at. But I retired from medicine several years ago and spend my time writing editorials and various things now.
Hmm. Well, you're such a good writer, and there's a vast amount of research that goes into your books. I wondered if you studied writing or if you just picked that up along the way.
No, I'm still a novice at it. I didn't have any training in writing anything.
Hmm.
I love the art, though. I love the discipline because I have always read widely. It sort of comes pretty naturally.
Hmm. Would you say One Mind is your magnum opus, or are there some other books of yours I need to go back and read now?
I wouldn't torture you by recommending that you go back. That's an adequate summation of where I've wound up. I haven't written any books since then, so I guess that's a pretty good beginning and a stopping place.
It seems like covers an exhaustive amount of material, very comprehensive.
Yeah, I think it's pretty comprehensive. The theme that runs through all my work is the primacy of consciousness and really a redefinition of consciousness as being non local, that is to say, infinite in space and time without boundaries, therefore united. And it's only one aspect of who we are. The other, of course, is our individuality. And I think our individuality and our consciousness sort of exist as a natural complementarity. We need both of these aspects of who we are to be whole, to be human, and also to spare us the greatest amount of suffering I think human beings ever experience, which is the fear of mortality. I think we need to replace that with immortality because I think that's where the data clearly points that we are beyond the brain, consciousness wise, and have an infinitude of consciousness to look forward to.
Hmm. Yeah, that seems to be the big question to me is mind fundamental or is matter fundamental? Because the dominant view in our culture, what we're taught in schools, is that the physical world came into existence in 13, 14 billion years ago and only very recently evolved to a point where beings developed consciousness in their brains as some secretion from the chemical interactions, that this is a new sort of add-on.
Yeah, I kind of chuckle at that. I've been dealing with that definition all through medical school, and still the greatest number of neurologists out there who are supposed to know about these things swear that it's all a matter of the brain. I think there's scant evidence for that, however, and I think we've sort of been hypnotized to swallow this materialistic version of who we are, for which there is very little evidence. In order to hang on to a materialistic viewpoint, you have to ignore the entire corpus of evidence that comes from parapsychology, which I think is absolutely profound. And I think it's intellectual cowardice to ignore this non-local, infinite aspect of who we are that has no intention of obeying the constraints of space and time. I run into this debate all the time, as you can imagine. I used to collect comments from skeptics of this point of view. My favorite, I'll share with you, is from one physician who said, "This is the sort of thing I wouldn't believe even if it were true." So that perhaps can give you some of the closed-minded aspects of this eternal debate about the nature of consciousness.
Yeah. The idea that the physical world is all that exists, that's a dogma in itself. It's a philosophical position that a person is taking as their starting point.
Well, it begins to be very hypocritical because in order to defend that point of view, the materialist point of view, you have to ignore an enormous body of evidence which says that it's certainly not true.
Before we get into some of the evidence in your book, how would you define mind? Do you mean the same thing by mind and consciousness, or is there a distinction?
Well, I think there is a distinction. I think most of what we refer to as mind, certainly the way you use the term and I use the term, suggests that there are levels of intelligence that transcend our waking awareness. So I think our awareness comes out of our overall consciousness, but consciousness is often, as many people have pointed out, exceedingly unconscious. So there's a kind of unconscious awareness about how all of this works that cannot be apprehended by just focusing on the brain.
And then how would you define the one mind?
Well, the one mind is the collective awareness and unawareness that unites every living thing. I don't think this is a particularly human trait, although it's more advanced than humans. Certainly, as people like Rupert Sheldrake have pointed out, we can have distant, non-local communications between humans and animals. So there seems to be a gradation of consciousness that extends quite a ways across living creatures. It's certainly not unique to human beings.
And how about the relationship between our individual minds and the one mind? I know we all have a lot of junk floating around in our minds, and whether news of the day or negative thoughts and such. Is that all somehow part of the collective mind?
Well, most of it doesn't get transmitted non-locally to other people, thank God.
Hmm.
There are qualities of our consciousness that do make transmission of consciousness across space and time more likely. If I had to pick one quality that favors this transmission of the one mind, it would be compassion and love. I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but this seems to be a quality that favors the appreciation of one mind across the individuals and actually across the species as well.
Hmm.
So if I had to pick one quality of our day-to-day consciousness that favor this appreciation of the one mind, it would have to be something on the order of love.
Hmm. Great. I'll list a few of the categories of evidence you have in your book. You have chapters on heroes who risk their lives for others, on premonitions, on telepathy, near death experiences, children with memories of past lives. One of my favorites is your chapter on savants. You talk about mathematical savants who can solve any equation or name a prime number with hundreds of digits off the top of their heads. And clearly, they're not calculating that in their brains. They have access somehow to a greater realm where that information lies.
Actually, I'm interested to hear you say this because you express my attitude as well. I bump into people all the time who are so-called experts on brain metabolism who swear that this is just a brain phenomenon. I can't for the life of me see how the brain could produce this kind of information. So this is a tit for tat argument among people who think about consciousness. And Sam, I'm glad to have you on my side.
Do you have a particular favorite category of evidence among the chapters in your book?
Yeah, it would have to be something on the order of an epiphany, a sudden, spontaneous awareness that this is the way things work, a position that isn't arrived at by logic and by weighing of data. I don't think that can get us there. I mean, this is an ancient form of awareness, a mystical kind of awareness, if you like, which doesn't depend on reason at all. So it would be a spontaneous eruption of understanding that is my favorite category of proof.
Mm. Yeah, you talk about Einstein describing where he got his ideas, his hypotheses, and how they would often come in an image or a flash of insight.
Yeah, he was pretty explicit about this, that he didn't arrive at his conclusions by logic. He gets them from the universe, he said. This is extremely frustrating to brain oriented people who like Einstein for his evidence and his proofs, but that don't like how he got there. But he was explicit about this, and I admire him for that.
Then, of course, once he has the intuition, then it has to be tested, and he needed to get the evidence to back it up, right?
Exactly right, which he did beautifully.
You have a chapter on twin telepathy, intuitive communication between twins, and you said your interest came from being a twin yourself.
Well, not just a twin, an identical twin. I think this must have had something to do with my eventual beliefs about the non local nature of consciousness. I say that because my identical twin brother and I have had weird experiences all of our life. Even though far apart, sometimes we would experience pain in the identical part of the body for no obvious reason, simultaneous thoughts at a distance. And when we were growing up, we didn't know that there was anything particularly unusual about this. We just lumped this into a category we refer to as twin stuff. And their parents were totally used to this sort of thing. So I came by this idea of the one mind quite naturally. To compound things, I'm married to a twin.
Wow.
And my wife and her twin brother, who is about 800 miles distant, continue to this day to have these weird simultaneous experiences of simultaneous dreams, pains in the same part of the body at the same time. There's no way neurologically to explain all of this stuff. So I seem to be awash in this kind of experience. And so I don't know why this happened, but this twin stuff, this simultaneous distant knowing and experiencing has been part of my life history.
You have some amazing stories in the book about some twin brothers who, for instance, married women with the same name, had kids with similar names. I should say they were separated at birth, so they had no idea that they were pursuing parallel lives, as it were.
Actually, if you go looking at the literature, the twin literature, some of these things just defy reason.
Yeah.
They shouldn't happen, but they do happen. So I have dug into this literature because of personal interest. And even I was shocked about some of this stuff.
I guess a skeptic might say, well, it's all determined by the DNA. These two people share the same DNA, so they end up being attracted to a woman with the same name, though they're separated and don't know each other.
Well, you can always pin things on DNA, which DNA is not capable of. Nobody knows how DNA would code for some of these things. And I take that explanation with a grain of salt. There is a famous book called Twin Telepathy, which I would recommend to anybody who has an interest in this sort of thing. I just don't think that you can get out of DNA everything that twins experience. There's no way that we know that DNA codes for simultaneous thoughts at a distance. And
Mhm.
so I just sort of have to shake my head in disagreement with some of these so-called explanations.
Yeah. It seems to me that a lot of biologists are stuck in a older paradigm of reality with the neo-Darwinian view of things, which says that DNA combined with natural selection explains everything. It seems they haven't integrated the findings of quantum physics. What do you think on that? Do you think there hasn't been enough communication between the physicists and the biologists?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because there's plenty of weirdness in the theory behind quantum mechanics that is fully capable of explaining distant transmissions of thoughts. And I would just put this concept of non locality at the top of the list. Non locality plus entanglement, which is at home in quantum mechanics, is fully capable of explaining some of these non local transmissions and communications between twins. I was fairly shocked about the adequacy of quantum mechanics years ago when I discovered it as a possible explanation for some of these things. I mean, we're at sea in terms of our understanding of consciousness in the first place. So I think, although quantum mechanics may be a stretch for some people, I'm convinced that there is great explanatory power in the theory of quantum mechanics to explain some of this weirdness that goes on between people.
Yeah, and one of the most remarkable findings, of course, in quantum physics is that a conscious observer plays an important role. For instance, they don't know whether a photon will be a wave or a particle until it's observed, and then it seems to decide at that point. So, this idea that consciousness is primary runs through quantum physics.
Exactly. And if you read some of the theoretical writings of some of the truly great physicists of the 20th century, such as Erwin Schrödinger, who is one of my favorites, you find that they were at home thinking about the nature of consciousness and its relatedness. For example, Schrödinger's own record as saying there is only one mind. So, this idea of the one mind may sound very exotic and far flung in terms of logic, but some of the greatest minds of the 20th century have held this idea as part of the underlying philosophy of their personal life. I don't know who would call Erwin Schrödinger, who won the Nobel Prize in 1933, I don't know anybody who would call him a thoroughgoing mystic. But certainly, many of his ideas about the nature of consciousness are totally mystical, including the fact that he thought there was a single, unitary, unlimited form of consciousness that unites everyone. So, people are free to attribute this to mystics if they want to, but it was also adopted by some of the greatest physicists of the 20th century.
Yeah. We were talking about how, in the materialist view, the physical world evolved over billions of years, and then consciousness is this recent add on. I was pondering how, even in our churches, it's taught that God created the physical world, created Adam, and then breathed consciousness into him. So, again, in that biblical worldview, consciousness seems a later add on.
Yes, but there are several religions around the earth that don't follow the Christian doctrine of creation. So I would just consider that from the standpoint of religion, worldwide, it's still an open question.
Yeah. And it seems the ancient Hindus preceded quantum physics by thousands of years. I just recently read a condensed version of the Upanishads and was just blown away by the depth of wisdom in that book. I think it's head and shoulders above a lot of our Western religious texts. The focus of the Hindu mystics was that the self, the universal self, is everything. And through meditation, we can realize that our consciousness is a spark from that universal self. I think that's right in line with your book and what we're talking about.
I think so too. I remember my discovery of Hinduism many years ago, and I was delighted to stumble into this body of knowledge. This happened when I was in medical school, and I grew up in conservative Christianity, and I was delighted to find a major world religion in which people had this idea about the primacy and the fundamental nature of consciousness. It was just like a breath of fresh air. And so I embarked on a reading of Hindu sources that actually is still going on.
Hmm. Yeah, I grew up fundamentalist Christian as well, so we've come from the same place. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher from Texas, and he moved to Michigan, and that's where I ended up being born.
Well, we have similar backgrounds. When I was in elementary and high school, my desire was to become a Protestant preacher.
Oh, wow.
I had already made plans to go to Baylor University for pastoral training. So this was a serious effort on my part to remain within Christianity. But sometimes during college, things don't go as well as you think they should. And I became infatuated with modern science, biology in particular. And through medical school, my early training really never had a chance.
Hmm. Did then spirituality come back into your life when you were introduced to this idea of the one mind?
Yes, more profoundly than it had ever been theretofore in my life.
Hmm.
So I consider myself a much more deeply spiritual person than I ever experienced in my early life. And so for me, spirituality and religion definitely do not go hand in hand.
Hmm. I read a book last year that I enjoyed quite a bit called The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, and then I turned it over and saw you have an endorsement on there.
I enjoyed that book.
I was pretty surprised to see your name on a book about the history of Christianity.
Yeah, well, I think Timothy Freak is one of our greatest spiritual writers.
Yeah,
I have a deep sympathy for his work.
that's great. I definitely agree with you. It's amazing how wide ranging your interests are, from religion to medicine to consciousness.
Well, some people call me a dilettante. That's the other view of my wide-ranging interests. So
Hmm.
not not everybody is amused by my interests.
Well, I'm similar to you in having wide interests, but I certainly don't have the aptitude or patience to go to medical school and learn to be a doctor. So I'm really impressed. I'm looking up to you, that's for sure.
Well, I'm looking up to you, and I went on the internet and I saw your string of books, and good heavens, I don't know how you've done that, but
They're very short. That's how I've done. I write very, very short books. That's my secret.
well, I admire you nonetheless.
Thanks. If you were me, you would break up one mind. Every chapter would be a separate book. That's how you would do it if you were me.
Well, that's one way to do it.
Uh, so you mentioned being more spiritual now than before. Do you have any practices you use to cultivate your relationship with the one mind?
There are several things. One is that I've carried on a meditation practice for many, many years. I find also that when I'm out in nature, things become more clear to me and spirituality asserts itself almost naturally.
Hmm.
For 30 years, my wife and I have taken a month off in the summer and took refuge in the Rocky Mountains, somewhere between the Canadian and the Mexican border, and simply live outdoors in a tent. We fish and we hike. We've covered most of the Rocky Mountains doing this year after year. For us, this has been one of the most spiritually enriching and rejuvenating things that we've ever discovered. I can't imagine spirituality divorced from nature,
Hmm.
but that's just me.
Yeah. Well, you have that in common with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, that's for sure.
Well, that's right. That's right. I was fascinated really by the tie-in between your name and Thoreau's. I'd put that on my CV if I were you.
Even though I think we're very distant relations, but as soon as I found out that the Thoreaus and Thoreaus were related, I thought I'm going to claim him as a cousin.
Boy, I would.
I know you wrote about discovering a book of Emerson's essays in a soda shop when you were a teenager.
Well, I talk about being blindsided and knocked for a philosophical loop. That was my experience. We lived on a farm, and my brother worked in the teenage hangout, a drugstore in the town, this little town of 2,500 people, which was 3 miles from our farm. And I would go and pick him up at night when he finished his duties and rummage through the books in the little wire revolving rack. And I don't know how a book by Ralph Waldo Emerson wound up in this rotary rack, which housed mostly westerns and detective novels. But there was this little book, essay by Emerson. It caught my eye. I didn't know who Emerson was in high school, but I just flipped this book open and I was riveted. That was my introduction to Emerson, and it proved to be a permanent attraction. I was absolutely riveted by what I read, and I've been a fan ever since.
Great. Could you distinguish between mind and spirit? I know I have a hard time explaining how those two would be different, mind and spirit.
They're tied together, and I don't think anybody can logically separate them. But beyond that, there are things that consciousness can do, which the brain is incapable of. One of these is apprehending information at a distance. There's no way that, as far as we know, that the brain can operate beyond the reach of the senses and do this reliably without any known mechanism. But consciousness is very good at this. Telepathically, we're a genius. Clairvoyantly, we are capable of remote viewing. Precognition happens all the time in terms of dreams. And sense wise, we have no business knowing these things. I think that it's conservative to say that there's something about consciousness that operates outside the brain beyond any known brain mechanism, which is why materialists roundly ignore and condemn this sort of evidence. They have no place in their worldview to explain this. And so that's really why there's this divide between spiritual people and materialists, hardcore materialists. And it has to do with dedication to the brain. I don't know if this makes much sense at all to people who have not had these experiences, but once you have had them, then there's no going back.
Yeah. I know when I first became aware of materialism, I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty dreary philosophy.
I agree 100% with your conclusion.
Yeah, it seems to me too limiting to say that the only things that we can say are real and true are those we can observe in a lab that are repeatable results.
Well, I think the lives of most materialists, if you examine them pretty closely, are just hermetically sealed from evidence to the contrary. As evidence for this belief, I would just cite the entire corpus of parapsychology, which concerns itself with things that happen at a distance, happen into the future, and no one can come to terms with this body of evidence and hang on to a materialistic point of view, in my opinion.
During your medical career, working as a doctor, did you see examples of things like telepathy or precognition in your own experience?
Well, that's sort of putting it mildly. I had precognitive dreams about patients I would see the next day whom I hadn't seen before. I would sometimes arrive at diagnoses which proved absolutely accurate on the basis of dreams. And Early on in my career, I was really hesitant to publicly discuss this sort of thing, but I was weaned out of that hesitancy by several spectacular examples of life saving issues that I couldn't ignore anymore. Besides that, the nurses that I worked with sniffed out my beliefs and began to chime in with experiences of their own, which corroborated my non local knowing and which really invigorated me to go public. Also, I had a very active lecture life as a physician. I talked to many of the major medical schools in the country about the nature of consciousness. And occasionally I would slip in one of these parapsychological phenomenon, which had medical implications. And here's the interesting thing. After I would do this, invariably in the Q&A session, a doctor or two would stand up in this big audience and contribute their own heretical experiences that chimed in with mine. In one experience like this, after I had confessed my experiences along these lines, a female internist stood up and she said, "Well, I don't think this is very peculiar. As a matter of fact, I have dreams about future events." She said, "I dreamed the results of my patients' laboratory tests before I even ordered the tests." This was an example of if you give doctors permission to come forward to talk about these outrageous, outlandish things, you may be surprised about the number of physicians who actually experience these. This was a revelation to me, and it made me much, much less hesitant to talk about my own experiences in groups of physicians.
Yeah, I know you wrote about how a lot of people are afraid to come forward and share these unusual experiences because they'll be seen as irrational or crazy, even.
And usually, what happens, Sam, is after a lecture I would give in which I would not be totally explicit about my own experiences along these lines, several of the doctors in the audience would meet me in the hallway after the talk and say, "I think this is what you were hinting at, and I would just like to share my experiences with you." And then they would launch into these personal experiences with patients that would make my experiences look minor league. So,
Wow.
so I began to become more courageous with passing years and much less hesitant to share my experiences along these lines.
That's great. Did you run into any trouble with the authorities at your hospital once you started speaking out more?
There were one or two physicians who were really opposed to this sort of thing, who accused me of debasing medical science and talking like a new age fanatic. But I had the upper hand because I was chief of staff of the hospital. You don't get to be chief of staff unless you're approved of by the majority. And so I just ignored them.
So you were the authority at that point, and that helps.
Yeah, it would have been difficult to fire me. I was, they elected me chief of staff. So, I had their admiration. I was a good doc and a board certified internist and a leader, in their opinion, among the staff. So I could get away with a lot of stuff.
Great. When we come to accept this idea that our minds are all connected, that we have access to this one mind, what difference does that make in our lives on a practical level?
Everything. I think it makes all the important differences that we confront as human beings. If you reason through the implications of distant knowing, of knowing between people without the intervention of the senses or the physical brain being able to engineer all of this, I think you're driven to the position that mind is not localized at specific points in space and time. I think that's a minimal conclusion from this evidence that we're alluding to. If you take that point, that consciousness has no boundaries in space and time, then you, I think, arrive at the position that if there are no boundaries, death is really virtually meaningless. We erect death as one of the boundaries of life. If there aren't any boundaries, then death has to be redefined. I think this leads many people, and I'm not talking about just myself, but many people have thought deeply about this. It leads to the point of the belief in immortality. Immortality is a situation in which consciousness is not bounded by birth or death. It simply has no boundaries in space and time. I think this is the greatest cure for the greatest disease that has ever afflicted human beings, which is the fear of physical death. I think most people have been hypnotized in this materialistic culture to assume that when physical death supervenes, it's all over. Well, there isn't any over, no end to consciousness if it has no boundaries in time. So this leads to a belief based on evidence, experimental evidence of the belief in immortality. So I think this makes all the difference in how we live our lives, the tranquility, the peace that we experience on a daily basis as we get older, as we approach death, because we see that death is not a boundary of life, but is simply transition. We get hints of what this transition may be like from the 15 million Americans now who have had near death experiences and have decided to tell about it. So I think this gives us a fresh view of hopefulness and a reason to situate our belief in immortality not in religious context, which are fine as far as they go, but also in terms of actual experimentations that anybody can do, showing that their consciousness is not bounded in space and time. So I think that it's very difficult to overemphasize the importance of these particular views in how we live our life.
I'm thinking it would also have a profound effect on how we treat each other and even national, international relations if we all realize that we are all one, we're united in one consciousness.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. If human beings are going to survive the challenges that face us in terms of the environment and political strife and this eternal temptation to declare war, I think it's going to be through the spiritual recognition that we are united. There is no evidence that there are other human beings who are totally separate from us. This has every implication of tolerance and seeing other human beings as brothers and sisters.
Wonderful. In my own experience, my most profound experiences of the one mind have been through psychedelic plant medicine ceremonies. I wonder if that's anything you've researched or.
Yeah, I experimented several years ago with plant-based psychedelics, and it is certainly a way to this understanding that we're connected. I'm not endorsing this because not everybody deals gracefully with psychedelic substances. So,
Yeah.
but neither am I criticizing them because they can jumpstart our spiritual understanding in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Dossey, it's been wonderful speaking with you. You're certainly a hero of mine in the writing world, and I'm so grateful that you took time to talk.
Well, I wish my voice my voice had not degenerated before our conversation, but we go with what we've got.
Yeah.
I want to add also that your books are a new inspiration for me. I did not know about them until their conversation, and I will be finding out more about them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. I hope we stir up a few minds.
Thanks for listening to Living from the Soul. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, subscribe, and review. This is an ad-free podcast brought to you by my books, which are available at samtarode.com. The theme music was created by Gideon Tarode.